Thank you guys for coming to this final session. This is the 5th week we've been doing this program. We started organizing this program November, I want to say. November, yeah, that's when me and Ferris first met. So it's been a fun time, let's just say that. So today we are talking about neoliberalism and the global war on terror. I'll be honest, events this week kind of threw a lot of wrenches in what I wanted to talk about. So I figured that I was going to do a pretty short kind of thing. I mean, short-ish, you guys know me. And I will then try to do some recap. And I've got all the other slides pulled up from the other sessions, and I'd love it if we can go through, kind of give a little thesis for what we did in each one of the sessions, take questions, especially for people who weren't there at the sessions. Yes. So if it feels a little bit less structured, a little bit less clear, at least with argumentation-wise, well, that's because, as I've been talking about, right, it's very, very difficult to try to separate historical periods into little discrete chunks of time, and it's where we've been trying to come to an understanding of history as this continuous motion that just keeps on happening. And when it comes to talking about the last 40 years or so of American history, and we're going to be talking about a lot of American foreign policy, but let's say by foreign policy I mean economic and military policy. It's very difficult to make these hard conclusions for all of that because we're still living through all of the strategic and even tactical consequences that are going to come from something like the Iraq War. I know this is a fake quote, but I love it. Zhou Enlai, who is the Chinese foreign minister, he was famously asked what are the consequences of the French Revolution in the 1970s, and he said it's way too soon to tell. Fake quote, probably, at least mistranslated quote, but I love that quote because it kind of gets at what we're doing here. So, in that spirit, I called this lecture today "The Nightmare Upon the Living," which is also another famous quote from Marx from the 18th Brumaire when he's talking about Napoleon. And this is kind of the nightmare that we're living in is the one that is created from 1975 onwards. We talked about the New Left's defeat. Let's talk about what we did last week. So we talked about how World War II, or at least the long period of imperialist conflict in Asia and Europe, ended in the late 40s, and how European colonialism transformed into this new form of imperial control, right? We talked about the founding of NATO in that. We talked about the destruction of the French Empire and the British Empire at the same time throughout the 50s and 60s. And we talked about America becoming this new neo-colonial, literally, leader of the capitalist West, whatever we're going to call this, right? At the same time, when we were talking about domestic politics, we talked about not just domestic politics, the similar things were happening all across the world. This pact or this alliance between labor and capital, crucial in winning World War II, and then also crucial in helping reindustrialize and secure Western Europe. We talked about the Marshall Plan and stuff like that, right? In America, we talked about that pact with labor starting to being extremely strong throughout the 50s and 60s, and that's how the Great Society came around, right? And then we talked about that kind of the political organs of the old left that built this this pact between labor and capital, right? We talked about that in session 3 during the New Deal. We talked about those political organs, the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, completely crumbling, and then their successors, not really successors, but a younger generation who came around, the New Left, also trying something and then really, really failing throughout the 70s. And we ended it there, kind of on a low note. And today we're gonna end on a pretty low note as well, as much as we can. Really, today is like a story about what happens when there is absolutely no positive progressive force that is affecting international politics on any level, or any force that is designed and is working towards a struggle for working class liberation or colonial liberation, for that matter. Okay, so again, we talked about that pact with labor and capital, and this is the period where that is like completely and totally destroyed, right? It was kind of going away a little bit throughout the 60s and 70s. It was a little bit difficult to see what was happening, but especially with the election of Carter and Reagan in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a complete and total ideological, political, and economic shift in all of the major governing structures of not just the United States, but all across Europe. Those states then imposed these political, economic, and ideological changes across the entire world, right? So what's the major change we're talking about? Neoliberalism, right? And a fantastic word that nobody knows. And I still don't know. I try my best to give a definition on the guided notes, though I'm less talking about it in a philosophical, I'm trying to talk about it a bit in a philosophical term, but really from a practical economic perspective, what is it? So I would say it's best to describe neoliberalism as, in its historical context, as coming from a reaction from that pact you were talking about, right? The Social Democratic Pact throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s. In the 70s, there was a massive economic crisis, born from lots of different reasons, but the important thing to understand is that the world economy went through a massive period of stagflation, they called it, which is economic stagflation coupled with inflation, right? The dominant economic thought at the time was liberal Keynesianism, and Keynesianism completely failed to predict this kind of thing occurring, especially with government expenditure still happening. So economics departments across the entire United States, really, or the entire Western world, decided to go in a different direction, let's say. The first place we start seeing neoliberalism, as it becomes termed, put into practice is in Chile in the early 70s after the military junta takes over from Salvador Allende's party. I believe that's in 71, actually 9/11 on 1971 or 2, 3? 3? Okay, sorry, my bad. It is 9/11 though. That is when Allende was killed. Thank you, Mackenzie. So what are those policies? Okay, so on the notes, I basically say that in practice, neoliberalism is about securing corporate power and the primacy of corporate power at every single level of any governing structure you can imagine. Not just governing structures, but also society in writ large. So what does that mean? That means the state taking it upon itself to act in favor of corporations. So a big part of fascism, but also liberalism throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, is this idea that the state is supposed to be a mediating factor between labor and capital, right? It's supposed to come in terms, and in social democratic states, under Roosevelt, under Johnson, they're supposed to intervene on behalf of the working class, right? Neoliberalism kind of is the exact opposite, in that the state should, in every single way, intervene on behalf of corporate power. So how do we see that actually, implement itself? Number one, this massive, I think I called it lawfare, basically. So new policies and legislation that are targeted towards organized labor, unions, trade unions. There's a famous airline strike, right, in the 1980s or early 1980s that Reagan uses executive power to crush. All throughout in the United Kingdom, all throughout the early 80s and mid 80s, there are minor strikes, especially in Wales and Scotland. So, and all of this labor tension that ends up coming up is really brutally repressed, much more brutally repressed across the third world, in places like Chile, right, where unions are basically banned. It still is very, very difficult to be a part of a union in Chile today. And that was the case across the entire third world in this period. As this neoliberal ideology, or as these policies kind of took predominance in at least the elite centers of intellectual and academic reproduction, right? I know that's a crazy way to say it. Basically, what's happening is that all of the elite classes of society, not just in America, but also in places like India, in places like Africa, and all across Africa, Pakistan, whatever, Latin America, they all go in for this. Okay, neoliberalism is one of the most successful ideologies in world history in terms of the amount that it becomes hegemonic, which means that like it's completely and totally unquestioned, and the amount in which it is the speed with which it kind of takes over all of these institutions. It's remarkably quickly. Why does that happen so quickly? We'll talk about that in a moment. We'll talk about like the unipolar moment that America really enjoys in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But these policies are really about internationalizing capitalism in many ways, right? So capitalism has always been international, right? Ever since the birth of the Atlantic slave trade, at least. That is the moment of markets becoming internationalized. But when I say that capitalism becomes truly and totally globalized in the 80s and 90s, we're talking about capitalist social relations, right? So last week we talked about peasant revolutions across China and Vietnam and Korea, threatening peasant revolutions that are threatening to take over Iran, that do take over Cuba, that do take over Nicaragua in the mid-70s, right? So this is the period where like the idea of a peasantry in many ways ceases to exist. And you're very hard pressed to find an actual existing large peasant mass in the world today, anywhere, except for maybe the most extremely like rural and underdeveloped places on planet Earth. But China in this period, something like 200 to 300 million citizens go through a process of becoming proletarian, which means they become working class people living in urban cities, right? This doesn't just happen in China, right? It happens all across the colonized world, in India and in Brazil, in Argentina, in Cuba, right? In Nicaragua, all across Central America. Africa tends to lag behind on this. There are political reasons for that, in that there are, basically the entire continent is at war between the 80s and 90s, largely because of lots of reasons. Apartheid South Africa is a big reason for that. But this massive change, right? Again, we talked about how people living in peasant societies becoming proletarianized, going to an urban center is a really massive change in your consciousness and in the social relations of that society. People living in urban centers, they need healthcare, right? That's something they need, because otherwise everybody in a city will die. You can't have 1 million people in a city living together if you don't have sanitation and healthcare and all these kinds of things, right? So that's one way in which a massive change in material social relations produces these secondary and tertiary effects all across governing institutions, economic institutions, and ideology, right? So along with this internationalization, there becomes let's say, a change in the way international finance and the global trade system functions, right? Again, complicated reasons, but all of Latin America and Africa and most of Asia goes through a massive debt crisis in the late 70s and early 80s. Throughout the 60s and 70s, they had borrowed a lot from the IMF. Yugoslavia is also part of this, also indebted heavily to the IMF by the early 80s. And after that, the IMF and the World Bank now kind of like completely and totally captured by a neoliberal, by this neoliberal hegemony. They start radically restructuring third world economies. Now, they don't do this through military power, though in some places they do. They're mainly doing this through structural adjustment, which is basically saying that you're not allowed to get credit or loans from the international community unless you do these things. Remember, this is like a completely and totally hegemonic ideology. There is no the IMF, the World Bank, all the international systems you can be thinking of, including the United Nations, including whatever, is totally on the neoliberal chain, especially by the mid 90s, right, early 90s. So there's really nothing you can do about it. You have to work with something like the IMF and the World Bank. And so what does that mean? Well, first it means slashing taxes massively. This also happens in the United Kingdom, in America, in 1980, 81 or 82, Reagan signs into law massive tax rates that lower the top marginal tax bracket from like 70% to 50%, and then by 87, that top marginal tax rate goes down to 30%, which is around where it is still to this day. So there's a massive decrease in taxes, there's a massive decrease in government expenditure, there's a massive deregulation of the labor market. And what we mean by that is basically removing any and all labor protections or labor rights that economic rights that unions are supposed to have. There is a massive increase in the amount of currency there is in the world. I'm not an economics guy or like really hard into monetary policy, so I can't tell you too much about that. But the amount of currency in the world really increases. A big part of structural adjustment is free trade, right? Which is allowing the free movement of currency, goods, capital, and people between borders. And this really supercharges many parts of the global economy. It especially helps, America and Western Europe. Anybody who has a lot of their economy tied to the financial industry really benefits from this period. But also many countries in Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, basically see a massive influx of capital in this period. This is how they build large parts of what we now call like the Asian electronics industry. Taiwan with semiconductors. Japan was already an industrial power, but really, it explodes. Has a lot of amazing technical innovations in this time period. South Korea is in the exact same way. A lot of this is happening because this is a result of these free trade agreements or these free trade policies allowing massive amounts of Western capital into these countries. Great example of that kind of free trade agreement is NAFTA. Kind of destroys Mexican agriculture and agricultural industry, and nascent manufacturing industries. It destroys American industries as well, especially the heavy manufacturing the car industry in particular, though that was already on the decline. So all these things are happening at the exact same time. Do you see how I struggle to come up with large pictures and try to give you guys one conclusion for this period? Because this is recent history. This only happened 25 years ago. Everybody who was really alive then is still kind of alive and still kind of controls everything. So it's basically like trying to have a final conclusion or analysis of the entire international capitalist system, which is very difficult to do, especially when there's a war happening right now that is probably going to determine how that plays out, right? But what I really want you to get is that from 1975 to the 2000s, neoliberalism becomes hegemonic. All these policies spread across the world. There's nowhere on planet Earth that is not really doing neoliberalism in this time period. You can say maybe like North Korea and Cuba are like the only two, maybe like the only two places in the world that are not doing that. And even they end up doing market reforms. Cuba does market reforms in the mid-90s because of that, right? So everybody's on this train, right? Which means that there's a massive amount of political unity behind the U.S. dollar and its political organs, right? Which is the U.S. state, which is also the U.S. military. So why does that end up happening? I'm just going to skip talking about the WTO protests and EZLN. It's all kind of stuff where all active conflicts, right? Where people are still talking about this. It's difficult to have give you guys a conclusion for any of this. But so why does this, hegemonic new ideology, right? It's neo. Why does this come around, really? There's a big shift in global geopolitical economy, right? So the Soviet Union and all of the Warsaw Pact collapses throughout the 80s, really. It's very much a slow process, and then it's very much all at once. But Yugoslavia is in collapse even earlier, like in the late 70s and early 80s. It's going through its collapse. China announces reform and opening up in the late 70s, but even before that, during the Sino-Soviet split, China had essentially aligned itself completely on a geopolitical level with the United States and against the Soviet Union. So the United States, China is a big part of funding funding regimes like China becomes a great friend of Pinochet in this time period, for example, right? And a lot of different South American regimes, because they are actively aligning themselves with America, because in Chinese strategic thinking at that time period, they believed that the Soviet Union was a much bigger threat than the United States. So all of this together, China opening up, the Soviet Union completely collapsing, Yugoslavia collapsing, a few other things I'm probably forgetting, but all these things produce a really unique moment in world history, where you have a U.S. empire that has basically complete and total say over everything that's happening in the world, right? And a certain kind of ideology comes about from that. Number one is, obviously, a hegemonic ideology of literally every single place in the world has to do this. There's not a lot of like variation you're allowed. But it also, it also encourages American strategic thinkers, right? And by that I'm talking about people like Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz. People like this who were high up in the national security establishment in the 80s, 90s. George H.W. Bush, great example of this. He was the head of the CIA, longtime CIA officer. They decide that this is an amazing opportunity to really reestablish American imperial and military power across the entire world. Or maybe not even reestablish it, more like reestablish imperial power across the world. America never really has complete and total imperial control over places like Iraq or Syria or Vietnam or anything like that before that. Those are all, as we talked about, those were all products of European, British and French colonialism. But these new strategic thinkers in the U.S. and in U.S. policy departments, where we tend to call them neoconservatives, right? They decide that this is a unique opportunity to really implant themselves militarily all across the world, but especially within the Middle East. Why? I mean, you kind of know why. The petrodollar is a massive, massive part of the American economy, and for the last 50 years, we've had a massive, massive interest in not just stabilizing the Middle East, but ensuring that us alone has complete and total strategic control over the Middle East. And what does that mean? That means nobody is able to challenge you in any way on a material level. Mm-hmm. So that means having allies across the region, having military bases across the region, etc., right? So the neoconservatives really take this and run with it. Okay, the first kind of instance we see of that is Gulf War I, right? So that's after Iraq invades Kuwait. Whole story behind that. Won't get into it, but I support Iraq invading Kuwait. And in response, the United States gathers a massive coalition. The entire world invades Iraq in 1991. The Russia, which now has not even Russia, I think at the time the Soviet Union refuses to veto the invasion of Iraq, right? So this is and China goes along with it. China goes along with the second Iraq War as well, right? So this is what we mean by total and complete unipolarity. We could not imagine Russia or China today giving complete and total say-so for these kinds of wars, which are about reestablishing American military might in the region, right? Okay, so let's keep going. We have this unipolar moment, okay? That is really pushing the spread of neoliberalism, a specific kind of capitalism across the world. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with, right? At least in the society we have today. I can't really tell you much more than that, because that's what we know is plainly true. Everything else is kind of up for grabs and open to a lot of interpretation. I don't want to just give you my interpretation, right? Okay, so let's talk about the global war on terror. And did the United States, intentionally maybe do 9/11, or is it more as we think, this kind of this unintentional thing that happened? I don't know anything about the actual conspiracies or whatever. But when I say Bush did 9/11, I mean that everybody and every single person who did 9/11 was trained by George H.W. Bush as the head of the CIA. Throughout well, maybe not him personally, because he was only the head of the CIA in the late 70s, but he was a longtime CIA officer. That starts really in Operation Cyclone, which is a paramilitary covert war against the Soviet Union in the late throughout the 1980s. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1977, I believe, around then, maybe 1978. We've heard about the Mujahideen, we've heard about all this kind of stuff. Another kind of thing of like where I want to explain more, I want to talk more, but like, the effects of Operation Cyclone in particular are still playing out around the entire world. So Al-Qaeda is still a thing all across the world. In Africa and in Syria, they're actually the head of the Syrian government right now, basically. So all these things still really up in arms, but what we got to know is that there's a massive connection between these new paramilitary threats or these new paramilitary entities and the Gulf states, which by which we just mean reactionary Arab regimes, as well as Pakistan, another one of these reactionary Middle Eastern allies of the United States, all backed by American money, right? Massive amounts of American money. We're talking about a massive international finance explosion that happens in this time period. Where's that money coming from? In a specific way, for Operation Cyclone and for the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, that money is coming directly from the cocaine trade and the heroin trade in Afghanistan's case. Another reason why this is hard to talk about is everything here is completely and totally opaque. There are no records for anything that is happening in this time period, right? I can talk to you about Vietnam and about COINTELPRO as we did last week. I can talk about these kinds of things because at least we have some records, right? The U.S. government will officially deny the vast majority of everything I'm talking about today, right? So it's difficult, again, to have these big, conclusive historical arguments, right? But what we can say is that that America experiences a massive increase in its security complexes, its military-industrial complex, as a result of this new war on drugs and then this war on terror, right? Which really are two parts of the exact same coin, and they're working in tandem. I believe the president of Peru was the first person who ever coined the term narco-terrorist, but and we're hearing it a lot today, but it's actually much more common in the 80s and 90s to hear the term narco-terrorist. I'm almost certain Saddam Hussein was called a narco-terrorist, but the Sendero Luminoso, which is the shining path in Peru, great example of this kind of thing, where you have these leftist, nationalists, sometimes even reactionary, paramilitary forces that are against the American government or against their ruling regimes all across this region, and they're involved in either the arms trade or the cocaine trade or the heroin trade in Asia's case, really, I mean also in Mexico's case, that are all kind of secretly know each other, right? Again, opaque as hell. You don't know anybody who's doing all of this kind of stuff, but they're all moving in a similar circle or in a similar network, right? And so this network gets set up throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And now it's just kind of out there, and nobody has total control over it, right? And traditionally, that's why we say, oh, okay, so America sets up this system in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then we fuck it up, and that's why 9/11 happens, right? And that's not a like bad historical argument or a bad historical analysis or thesis to make, right? It's difficult to try to tell you guys a larger political thesis. I'll tell you mine, all right? That's what I'm trying to get at here. I would say that American policy, strategic policy, right, in the 80s and 90s, because of its unipolarity, switches, right, against being about countering, a major power in the Soviet Union and a major power in China by creating strategic relationships with these third world countries, right? We talked about that last week. Creating these strategic relationships, doing the things like the Green Revolution we talked about, sending aid, doing this, right? All these things that we talk about as like, pillars of American liberalism or whatever. And we talk about Trump right now, like throwing these things away, right? USAID, great example of this, right? Those are institutions and structures that are made in the Cold War, but are really being destroyed immediately in the 1980s. And after that, the strategic policy really starts to be more about maintaining total domination, at least military domination and economic domination over key important regions. And in order to do that, in my opinion, I think that the American intelligence apparatus and security apparatus basically fomented complete and total chaos across the entire Middle East for 30 years or so. I don't even think that's necessarily, that's American strategic thinking, but I don't think that's first American strategic, that was first America's strategic thinking. I think that's the neoconservative, a very specific policy of neoconservatives in the Republican Party in particular throughout, from the 90s onwards. But really they are copying Israeli strategy, which they start to do around the early 80s. So Israel invades Lebanon in 1982. It's not the first time they had invaded Lebanon, but it was the really big one, except the ones that happened last year, and then the one that happened in 2006, and then the one that happened in 2000, and the one that happened. Anyway, Israel's goal in invading Lebanon, right? It's not like in Vietnam, right, where when America invades Vietnam, it's about setting up a pro-capitalist state. It's about stopping communism from spreading over all of Asia, right? Domino theory. That's what we talked about. When Israel invades Lebanon's in the middle of a civil war, and their thinking, right, at that time is basically, let's do whatever we can to make sure Lebanon doesn't have a stable state. And Lebanon still does not have a stable state. So, in many ways, this strategy completely and totally worked. There are plenty of reasons why we can think of why Israel in particular has this strategy in the region, right? But what's important is that America essentially adopts this completely by the 90s, especially these neoconservatives, where it's no longer. Remember, Saddam Hussein was a very close ally, right, and could still have been an ally. Iran was cooperating with the United States in the early 2000s. Right? Syria, after 9/11, the Assadist government was held like thousands of American prisoners or prisoners from Iraq, so that the CIA could torture them there. Right? So there are all these states that could be really, really good allies, or were very good allies, but our thinking changes, and it goes basically, it shifts towards saying that these governments, because they do represent sovereign or independent entities that don't have total control, that America doesn't have total control over. Like Syria is a functioning society. It's got 30 million people. It's got an industry. It's got cities and all this kind of stuff. The GCC countries that are our allies in the region now are not like that, right? They don't exist as entities, as national entities, as political entities. They really they depend completely and totally on a foreign backer. Which was first the British Empire and is now the United States Empire, right? So that's how this thinking really shifts. And again, a kind of thing where I can't tell you how that's going to turn out, except that I do think Iran is probably going to win this war right now. But who the hell is to say? And that is all. I'm just trying to give you guys a reason for why these, how we can look at these changes, right? Remember, what we're trying to do here is talk about historical materialism, try to come up with some idea for why these big changes in the economy, like neoliberalism, these big changes in political conditions, material conditions, like the collapse of the Soviet Union, create these new policies, create new ideas, a hegemonic ideology of neoliberalism defined by individual rights, defined by property rights, all this kind of stuff, right? So that's what we're trying to observe here. It's at least try to get through our heads. There's very little we can say beyond that, right? Except that this has been this specific war that's happening in Iran right now has been in the playbooks for many years at this point, and has basically already happened. This is basically the exact same thing that happened in Iraq, in terms of what the thinking is. The thinking is that it doesn't matter if we can negotiate with Saddam. It's much more about, if there's any sense of a sovereign Iraqi state that is a threat to American strategic thinking, right? To Israeli strategic thinking and American strategic thinking. So that's the neoconservative turn we see at this time period, right? Oh, did I forget to have a break slide? I did. Okay, so yeah, that's basically where we end, right? I don't even talk about 9/11 because, who's to say? The Patriot Act is still going on, and new laws might come around. New laws might come around tomorrow about all of that, right? So what can we say did happen? But as historical materialists, what are we saying? Okay, massive change in the economy because of neoliberalism, massive change in geopolitical conditions because of the fall of the Soviet Union, right? Those are the two major things to understand. In response to the fall of the Soviet Union, the American security state, which is really the NATO security state, because every single time America does a military action, it involves all of NATO, all of the West, not just NATO, also the GCC countries. When I'm saying this is the larger imperial strategic thinking of the time shifts towards against like countering these states. Like there's a reason why like Cuba was not invaded in the 90s, for example, because the Soviet Union doesn't really exist anymore, and America's like strategic policy is not really about like trying to invade another country and occupy it and have like territory for themselves. It's much more about, can we make sure that these countries have no ability to oppose us, right? That's what Gulf War I is about, really. That's what Gulf War II is about, really. So those three things is what I will is what I think we can try to take away from this, if we can take anything away at all, right? Massive change in the economy, then we get a massive change in the geopolitical conditions of the time, produces a massive change in military strategic thinking that we are all living through today. And that's basically it for the last 40 years, or what I can try to give as a reasonable lecture or reasonable materialist history of what happened, right? Because it is so close. I'm so sorry, I forgot to have a slide that said break, basically. But we can have a break now if everybody would like.